Liz, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to part 3. As y'all heard from Liz, this is NCEDA's product development webinar series. Again, we kicked off this thing back in June with a discussion around the competitive landscape, then followed up in August talking about building local support. I believe we've got Jennifer Lance, a few others that were our panelists on this call today. So again, thank you to Jennifer, Donnie, and others that participated in that call. Today's webinar, again, restocking North Carolina's product inventory, part 3, site identification. All right, so we'll focus on identifying new sites, and we'll be hearing from experts on some of the challenges and considerations for practitioners. I'm Ryan Nance with North Carolina's Electric Cooperatives. I chair NCEDA's Professional Development Committee. Before we get started with the program, I'd like to acknowledge NCEDA's annual sponsors, whose logos you'll see on the screen now. These companies and organizations support every component of NCEDA's expansive mission and our growing body of programs. We thank all these sponsors for their generous support. And again, you see them scrolling up on the screen, and we'll touch base again towards the end of our webinar. So one of the continued challenges facing our economic development community is available buildings and sites. No surprise, we've heard this, but this issue is multifaceted with many hurdles to clear as communities strive to be competitive. Today, our webinar will delve into the complexities of site identification, whether it's a mega site or smaller sites specific to the needs of your communities. So this conversation is particularly relevant right now in North Carolina and across the South. Many states and regional EDOs are working with local developers to identify new sites. And while the local and state economic development offices are doing a lot of the legwork, many allies of the economic development community are supporting their efforts. We've created a product development matrix on behalf of NCEDA to identify and explain the resources and roles of some of those allies: Golden Leaf, Commerce, railroads, and electric utilities. Y'all know them. But here in North Carolina specifically, there's been a concentrated effort to identify and invest in the new mega sites of the future, which is supported by a coalition of partners and allies, and of course led by EDP&C. Now I'm pleased to introduce our first panelist of today, and a familiar face to most of you, Mr. Garrett Wyckoff, Director of Business Recruitment at EDP&C, where he oversees day-to-day business recruitment operations and is responsible for leading and directing the organization's efforts to attract new corporate operations and high-impact expansions to our state. Garrett has worked in North Carolina's economic development community for many years and is a great resource. He graduated from Bowling Green State University in Ohio and lives in Raleigh. And I know in my early days at EDP&C, Garrett kind of showed me the ropes, and I'll be forever grateful for him. So Garrett, I want to turn it over to you right here. If you could give us an overview and update of EDP&C's new mega site initiative, get us up to speed, maybe walk us through the project, a little bit of background, basics, how you guys went about selecting a firm, but really most importantly, what are the timelines, deliverables, and anticipated outcomes of the initiative?
Well, great. Well, thank you, Ryan, for that nice introduction. And it's I'm glad to see we had so many wonderful partners and colleagues sign up for today's event. So yeah, Ryan has asked me to speak a little bit about the new mega site readiness program. A little bit of background about the program. As many of you know, in this past legislative session, the General Assembly has made a concerted effort towards trying to identify additional mega sites that the state can market, as we have seen, and you all have seen through RFPs and RFIs through our office. Just a huge number of projects that are, requiring, thousands of jobs, billions of dollars of investment, and along with that comes, upgraded or, updated infrastructure needs and all of that. So really where this I believe stemmed from is that with a number of the recent announcements that we have had, large announcements, VinFast, Wolfspeed, Toyota, you know, that the model that we have been so used to in North Carolina of kind of going to the General Assembly for individual projects, you know, or that one-off model, as I kind of refer to it, is really doesn't really work for the speed of business, does not really work politically and whatnot. So really when we've had discussions with members of the General Assembly, it was around how can we support you know, the current mega sites that we are marketing, as well as any others, to keep our pipeline full. You know, as Jay Garner likes to say, no product, no project. And, you know, we've got, you know, many projects looking at the same, you know, few mega sites that we have. So that's where a lot of this kind of stemmed from, is how can we get state dollars into these sites now, and get them more ready. As you know, again, as we've all have seen, these projects, not only are they, you know, they're a heavy lift, but the accelerated project timelines associated with them are crazy, to be honest with you. So if we can get sites more ready, I think that'll put us ahead of the game, ahead of our competition, as they are also, you know, struggling with this issue. So initially, the General Assembly has awarded or given us $1 million to kind of kickstart this program. That $1 million was to you know, hire a national, as the statute said, a national site consultant firm to help us with this effort. We at the EDPNC sent out an RFP to a number of well-known national site selection firms, engineering firms that do this type of work, you know, all across the United States. We received, that was done back in early, you know, the September timeframe. And we had a deadline of October 7th for those responses due back to us. We received 10 responses, and all of those responses, the national site consultant partnered up or teamed up with an engineering firm or an environmental engineering firm to present, you know, a team package of what they could do for North Carolina. We had an internal review committee that looked at those 10 responses, and we didn't have a set number of cuts we wanted to make. We just kind of let that, you know, kind of work itself out. We ended up with a final 4, and then with those final 4, we scheduled, you know, in-person or Zoom interviews to learn a little bit more about their response back to us. I will say that, you know, we did not take this, and we do not take this charge from the General Assembly lightly. We internally, you know, there was, you know, myself, Melissa, and some others on EDPNC staff. We created a subcommittee of our board made up of 3 of our board members to also participate in this process. And then we reached out to a number of our partners that have, you know, ongoing site selection or site identification programs and do this quite a bit more than we have. That included the Department of Commerce, Duke Energy, you know, because of their site readiness program, NCRR, Ryan and the co-ops. They were all part of this kind of internal committee that reviewed these RFPs. From there, we selected, or our board selected, we presented our findings and our information to the board, and they selected the JLL team led by Meredith O'Connor. I'm sure many of you, she's well known in the site selection industry. Meredith worked the first Toyota project that I was involved with a few years ago. She was on the site selector on most recent Toyota project, and she's just done a number of these large projects across the United States. They partnered up with the Timmins Group, as well as Nexen Pruitt. And I really think that even though we did not ask for that, that was a data point that this team brought that the others didn't. Having that legal team to be able to run things through or to assist with questions that may come up around, acquiring the real estate and things of that nature. That was an added bonus that we did not ask for or expect, but that kind of set the JLL team just slightly above some others. So what we have done since then, we are meeting, we are on a very, very tight timeline. We have about, I guess now down to 8 or 9 weeks left to get this all done. But the JLL team has we've taken a two-pronged approach. We held a webinar last week for all the interested parties and sent out an RFP. We're treating this like, a project, requiring uploading information into their system, and reviewing it all and treating it like a real RFP. We understand it's a heavy lift for everybody, as those responses are due back on Wednesday, November 30th. But this was one of the ways we thought we could identify some additional mega sites. The other approach that they're taking is through Timmins' system, their site selection system. They can identify tracts of land, put tracts together, and maybe come up with 1,000 contiguous acres, what is the General Assembly defined as a mega site. That we may not be aware of. So they're doing a lot of that internal review, desktop review, as our localities are putting together their RFP responses. From there, once we get those responses in and they are reviewed, we will conduct site visits, probably in the first couple weeks of December, and just get a better boots on the ground, better feel for the site and what will be ultimately needed to get it in a more ready state. Some of the other things they're also working with us on is there's a workforce, obviously a workforce component of this. They will be doing some workforce studies in and around where the proposed mega sites are, just to give us an idea about that data point. And also they are looking at individual target industry needs. Typically for a mega site, when you think of a mega site, it requires rail. But then you've got the chip manufacturing projects that cannot be near rail because of their facility cannot withstand the vibration from train traffic. So also they'll be diving into that individual target needs around what their infrastructure use and needs are. So from there, once all that is complete, we will work towards our deliverables. That is a final, or at least a final draft report to the General Assembly that's due in mid-January, outlining our findings and the best site assets that we have in the state. And then at that point, we will commence with, and ask for funding from the General Assembly that we will be able to manage and use to put forth, whether that's for helping localities acquire the property and or any of the infrastructure grading, infrastructure improvements, things of that nature to get the site more ready. I think, obviously from an anticipated outcomes, we're obviously looking for more and better product to market for these large projects. What we're hearing from site consultants is that they don't really anticipate an end, at least in the near future, of these large scale projects. Also, part of this will be part of the outcomes will be like, what other sites are available that may be less than the defined 1,000-acre requirement that would be good for future, for readiness and development. So I think that's part of this as well, is if we can, I feel like our charge, if we can knock this program out of the park and prove to the General Assembly how much it's needed and that we do a good job with it, I think future asks will be around how can we extend that program to other sites that are less than 1,000 acres that may be able to be more widespread, that we could use more widespread across the state. So I have received this question a few times and just thought it was important to just talk about it a little bit, and I think it leads into what my colleagues will be speaking about. Is why is this important for everyone? Because not every community or communities are going to have a mega site. So why should this matter to us if we don't have one? And I really think that a lot of it's going to revolve around that supporting supplier network that these large scale projects are going to require. We're seeing that many of them do not need to have suppliers on the same site with them. As long as they're within, and they're different for everybody, but, whether that's an hour, 2 hour, 3 hour radius of where the large project is. So I think that brings a lot of other communities into play for the sites that they currently have for this, anticipated supplier network that we're expecting. Along with that, is the need for those to be as quickly developed and ready as possible as well. Because once the anchor tenant, if you want to call it that, the large project lands and has their timeline of when they want to be in production, they're going to require their suppliers to also meet those same deadlines and timelines to be up and running to supply them. So it really is kind of a trickle down effect to get these, to get other sites ready as well. So I know we'll have time for additional questions and whatnot, but with that, I think I'm a little bit over time. I will kick it back over to Ryan.
Great job, Garrett. Thanks again for that really insightful update and all of EDP&C's efforts on this. It is a crazy aggressive timeline, and you guys are charging ahead nonetheless. So y'all heard Garrett will stick around. Very end, we'll have some Q&A that we open up to everybody. And on that point, yeah, y'all use the Q&A box down there. All right, so now we'll hear perspectives from two experts in identifying new sites, Victor Leota and Robin Spinks. You all know Robin well, but she is the principal of Greenfield Development and has spent equal time on all three sides of the economic development business during her 45-year career. So as not only a community recruiter selling industrial locations, as an owner buying industrial properties, and as a site selection consultant comparing communities for industrial locations. She has completed major projects across the Carolinas where she helps communities recruit businesses and helps businesses choose the right locations utilizing her unique skill set. She graduated from Furman University and lives in Wrightsville Beach. Gotta love that. Victor Leota, so a new face, and this is partly by design. You guys know Robin, but Victor is probably new to North Carolina given his work in other parts of the country. So again, have some outside perspective. Hopefully it'll help today. But Victor is the principal of Leota Location and Design and the creator of the Strategic Sites Inventory Program, which he has designed to foster a more modern approach to industrial site selection. He's expanded his SSI program to include landowner engagement, due diligence, and marketing. He graduated from LSU, lives in Baton Rouge, and Victor has extensive experience from the Gulf states into the Midwest. Indiana, Florida, and Louisiana alone account for over 3,500 potential new greenfield sites through his SSI program. Robin and Victor, it's been a little over 2 years now since NCEDA last had a webinar on site identification. We're excited to have the two of you today knock off the dust and also point out the latest trends and how the practice continues to evolve. And just for the audience out there, I know many of us by now are quite often familiar with kind of what goes into it, but I've asked Victor and Robin to really focus on process and really those specific headwinds as opposed to just the general site characteristics and fancy maps and stuff like that. So they're going to get into it with a brief presentation. And with that said, let's turn this over to Victor and Robin.
Thank you, Ryan, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks to NCEDA. And also, this was fortune for me because I got introduced to Robin, who I'd not known, and have really enjoyed working with her and preparing for this webinar. Thanks to everyone for your time. And we want to, as Ryan alluded to, we want to focus a little more on the process. I know that through previous webinars, you've learned a lot about not only the need to identify new greenfield sites to replenish your inventory, but also a lot of the characteristics that make a site nationally competitive and what the attributes look like, both for the site itself and its physical characteristics, as well as its surroundings and the market setting, the local community features as well. So I know that you're mostly very familiar with that. Robin and I today are going to partner on lending some perspectives on the process. How do you go about doing this? What are some of the potential pitfalls that you could run into, and what are some best practices to making sure that you have a successful product development program?
Okay, with that, I'm going to start, and I want to say, I know I'm going to sound a little bit like a preacher, and a lot of y'all have already heard this sermon before, but it's similar to a preacher. I'm really passionate about this purpose. Mary and I love site development better than anything else that we do. And in addition to that, we're going to save you from an ugly future because sites are a vanishing asset, especially in this growing economy, very much like what Garrett said. And so, and I'm going to give you 3 quick examples about this, about how valuable industrial real estate is and why we need to protect it. So just one example, the first example is, let me talk about railroad for a minute. There are 3,300 miles of railroad track in the state of North Carolina. There are only 3,375 miles of coastline, and we have the 2nd largest coastline in the country. And so we all know that waterfront property is valuable and we're careful about it. So I'm telling you, you need to do the same thing with rail sites. The second thing that I have heard that we've found out lately in a study is for New Hanover County, there are only 4,000 acres of industrial zone land in that county left forever. And so they really need to be protected. Third example is from Transylvania County over in the opposite side in the mountains where we did a project, and it's all mountainous. There are very few areas in that entire county where you can find 100 acres of flat land to develop an industrial park that are not in the mountains, and most of them are in the river valley, which means they're wetlands. And so it was very difficult for us to go up and down their highway corridors, which are also in those river valleys, and find the right site. So that's the end of my sermon, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of why this is so really very important and so the right sites, it's all about proactively identifying what you need. And so what do you need? You need sites that match your target industry. So for example, if you're looking for food processors, if that's one of your industries, you got to make sure it's close to a wastewater treatment plant and the capacity of a line to do that. If you're in the logistics business, you got to make sure it's right next to the highway and that it has rail. If you are looking to be one of those suppliers that Garrett talked about for battery projects, it's generally going to be either a chemical facility or some sort of metals related, and you need to make sure it's pretty far away from residents or they're going to be complaining about whatever the emissions are. So you've also got to have a really diverse portfolio for things that are not mega projects. We're focusing on mega sites right now, but also, so for example, you don't want to use, because of that valuable rail that I just described a minute ago, you don't want to put a non-rail user. If you have a fabulous industrial park that's rail served, please don't put a non-rail user in that and take up that valuable space that needs to be preserved for a rail user. So you need to be extremely proactive about what the right sites are, identifying them very broadly, and do not, and I'm going to talk, I can talk forever on the don't just wait till the owners bring something to you. And we can answer a lot of questions about how to deal with landowners who haven't come to you, but don't wait. Go look for stuff that works for you. And know that site development is it takes a long time. Y'all already know that. I don't have to tell you that, but identify it, then evaluate it, then go to the landowner, then go to the engineers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when the economy is on a downslide, that's when you need to spend all of your time that you have more of doing this site identification, so that when the economy gets booming like it has been the last couple of years, then you'll be ready.
So when we look at the overview of what we wanted to discuss today, really go through the steps of building a new greenfield site inventory. And where are those stress points? Where can you reach impasse? What are some potential fail points to beyond site identification to advance those sites to market? And then end with some perspectives on best practices to make sure that you have an efficient process and also a process that's successful in getting sites to, ready for development and to market. So we have, and I think a lot of these are common. The idea is that the main thing we'll talk about a little later is have a plan. And there's a lot of economic development organizations that have the wherewithal with staff and resources to do this internally. Some don't. And I would even argue that the site discovery process, really for every minute that economic development organization is spending in product development, or time that they're not devoting to business retention and recruitment. And so to the extent that you can find some help doing this with a consultant, you may find that you have a more a dedicated effort that likely will yield more sites that could be moved through a due diligence process much faster, and also assist with landowner engagement. At the end of the day, though, the local development positioning is going to involve alignment with future land use, comprehensive plan, zoning. So there's a tremendous need to formulate those partnerships with your local officials. As you move through the process of sites in advancement to market, the idea is to look at trying to mitigate challenges and improvements. There's no perfect site out there. They're all going to have some level of challenge or require some level of improvement. Our job as site consultants and in product development consulting is to try to find those sites that have the least amount of those challenges, and the preponderance of all the development advantages are going to generate interest in those properties and suggest that there's justification to spend some dollars to help make those sites ready for development. And at the end of the day, we're talking about trying to graduate new product to the open real estate market.
So where to start? I think the easiest thing to do is to create a tool. Now, Mary and I love GIS desktop and cloud access platforms, and there are a number of different kinds of them that are out there. And believe me, I'm old, and if I can learn how to do it, anybody can do it. So make sure you have access to one of these applications, and then you just turn it on. You start creating a database of information that you can search and sort to try to look for sites. You can add the data layers that match, and I'll talk about those in a second, but add the data layers for specific projects. So for example, if you're looking at supply chain for a particular company that's coming, you can go to the Hoovers and get a spreadsheet of the lat longe of the companies that are in that NAICS code and put that on the database. Proprietary data can come from your local water and sewer lines, which, as you know, not anybody can see that. And so those are some of the layers that you can put on. So as Victor was saying earlier, who can do this? Well, you can do it yourself. And you can, once you get those layers in, you look at your whole county and you just kind of follow up and down the railroad track or up and down the highway and click on the parcels that are undeveloped. So you can also get some help from your county tax office. They're the ones that already have this system in place. And so you might can get them to understand that technology a little better. But if you tell them what you're looking for, they could probably make all the initial identification for you with those layers. Or you can hire a consultant like us. So any of those will work, but just get started. Just do it.
Yeah, and I'll reiterate, the county property appraisers or tax assessors, depending where you're located. Robin's right, they're a tremendous asset. They know their backyard. Many of them have been there a long time. They know a lot of landowners. When we conduct local site reviews after identifying sites in a particular community or county, we always strive to bring in tax assessors because of their knowledge of their own backyard. So in the GIS, the mapping aspect of this is also going to lend a lot to process efficiency. The purpose of this map is just to show you how we can take all a proximity analysis. By convention, the features and conditions that you want to be near, challenge areas or conditions that you want to avoid, put weightings associated with those and put those into a spatial analysis that give you at least some relative sense of where there's areas of opportunity to look for sites. So the purpose of this is to show you that the bluer areas represent areas where we've got suitability based on a specific project land use intensity. This happens to be heavy industrial with a NAV water, class 1 rail and interstate dependent model. But really, I think the takeaway here is that if you look at the expanse of geography, there are relative few areas that are going to meet those requirements. And if you drill down to the county level, you start to begin to see how a subtle change in inputs to these models can produce a pretty drastic difference in the output that represents suitability for different types of project land uses. And so this is ultimately a way that you can eliminate a lot of geography in your site searches to begin creating a process of efficiency to then start to hone in on those tracks that might be suitable. Of course, from there, it takes a lot of subjective know-how, experience, and knowledge from engineering and environmental, community resource, cultural resource, et cetera, to discern which sites have actual value.
So here's some pictures of other data layers, but what you need to do, what we think, so you can see on there, there's a single site that we have for each of the pictures, and obviously it's an aerial with some flood and wetlands on it. Then the other one is a topo map, highway maps, and then the one that it sort of looks white, there's a little dot down there at the bottom. That's the proximity to a particular supply chain issue that this company had. The one with the purple lines are buffers. So you're looking at how far you can put a half a mile and a mile buffer up and down an electric transmission line to see how far away you want to be from it, because it's expensive to get there. And the circles are diameters away from a substation, for example. So those are just some examples of the types of layers that you can place on there. And what we want to say is that you need to make the layers that you are going to put on there. You can translate your site selection criteria into layers. So like the physical issues typically are related to capital costs. So you can quickly see the tax values and the actual parcel sizes, and infrastructure is the most important thing, period. Just period. Infrastructure has everything to do with sites and how appropriate is infrastructure for certain projects. You can see the wetlands, the topo, the brownfield, the business issues, operating costs, certainly whether or not, you know, what taxing jurisdiction you're in, how close you are to certain things like the port that you need, and what the that translates into transportation costs. And even the risk issues can be seen on the map. How far away from it is it to schools and hospitals and things that you don't want to be near. So those are just some examples of the data layers and what you can do with them related to the project. And then, the last thing that's there is everything is about infrastructure. So once you have identified your sites along the corridors and in your map, then you've got to go to your infrastructure providers and just confirm what the capacities and the capabilities are. So for example, and I've had this happen very recently, just because you've got an electric line there doesn't mean that it can serve the size of the project. And after that, you've got to physically see it with your eyes. The mapping is fabulous and great, but you got to physically go see it at some point, because there might be some things that you didn't know on the map, like where a cemetery was. Now you can get layers of cemeteries, but you may not want to have that on your initial, thing. Talk to the landowners. That it's critical. We can talk more about that later. Obviously, engineering goes afterwards. You got to figure out how to pay for it. And then you've got to regularly update the inventory. And the reason I say that is so critical is because you may talk to the landowners and they're not interested in any way, shape, or form. But let me just give you one little tip on that subject. So the average age of a farmer, by the way, is in their 60s. And I guarantee you, when they're gone, the kids, not many of them, if any of them, are going to stay in the farming business. And so that land might be available later on. So don't assume. And one of the things you might could do to find out about that is you might, in talking to your tax department, you might tell them which one of the sites that you've got your eyes on, so that they can ding you real fast if they see that it's changed hands for some reason. So, I mean, that's just kind of a small example of that sort of thing. But, there's, about capacities for water and sewer, but you might not know about rail operations. So you really also need to talk to them about whether or not a siding is possible. What's the configuration? What are the curves? There's a lot of technical detail even in rail.
So there's the process beyond identification of potential sites. So you go through and identify what you consider to be new greenfield sites that may have been on your radar, maybe not. The initial due diligence effort to do some preliminary due diligence, a lot of it is desktop through engineering and environmental studies. But the idea is to continue to move those sites to market. And obviously landowner engagement is a big component of that if sites are not currently on the real estate market or they're not publicly owned. And so through a lot of experience in hundreds of counties and thousands of sites, there's some trends that have come out of this that just in the essence of time here, we're going to hit the high points, and there may be an opportunity to delve into some of these in some Q&A. But we see a lot of issues you need to be sensitive about where there's properties that have been a lot of investment made in that potentially a local developer who can be a great partner in economic development. There may be some perceived conflicts of interest with that. Depending on what's been invested, what's being marketed, it's just something to consider. Obviously, the landowner motivation component of this, negotiation and wanting to lease or sell property, and obviously price. This is about being competitive, and that's a huge part of being competitive. And so we have some strategies that we like to look at with respect to stimulating some sense of competition with volume of potential sites in a given community, but having your liaisons that can work with landowners closely early, and often, as Robin said, to help make that as successful as possible. Local official cooperation and support. That can be where you have differences of opinion about land use and what economic development means. And we see a lot of issues where one or two officials attached on a county commission or maybe even county administration may not exactly agree with the direction of a particular piece of land. And that can create a lot of issues that ultimately need to be discussed internally and not in front of a prospect. And then public opposition, that's everywhere. That's just more of a messaging and communication, but also making sure that there's a sentiment across the community to support your target industries And that goes a long way in the positioning of properties for development to minimize any opposition from the public about the intensity of use. So these are just some of the areas that we see where you can either have stress points or impasse or even fail points for advancing sites all the market. And then finally, the idea of your current inventory assessment. When we look at best practices, you really need to know what you have to work with. Certainly most are very familiar, but how well do those sites that you have on the market, how competitive are they? Have they really been assessed, at least through some preliminary due diligence, to know how competitive they are? Is there justification to move forward with additional site search? Do you need to diversify? Perhaps you've got sites that are going to fit for a lesser intensive land use, and maybe you need to look for sites that are going to be better served for a heavier intensive use for certain industry targets. Have a plan. There really needs to be, this is a long-term, as Robin mentioned right up front, this is a long-term process. And going about this without any kind of a way to manage expectations, really, I think both internally and externally can be problematic if you don't have a good plan to have real estate asset identification. Strengthening your local stakeholder relationships is going to be key to all of this. And then building community support. As I mentioned earlier, political will to move these sites forward through comp plan amendments and land use and zoning, as well as the financial wherewithal to make those improvements to site where necessary and mitigate challenges. All these things work together to make sure you have a successful, not only identification of sites, but advancement of those sites to market and making them ready for permitting and development.
Awesome. Victor, Robin, thanks so much. You know, that's really helpful in teeing this up right here. We're going to just jump right into some a little bit of organized Q&A. We'll bring Garrett in here in a bit. Victor, let's stay with you, man. So really thinking if we just start from the point where the local practitioner has buy-in and really the green light from his or her leadership to identify new sites, how often do you see the practitioner having a close familiarity with potential sites versus not knowing possible sites in and around their communities? Are there still diamonds in the rough out there?
Yeah, the answer is yes, with respect to diamonds in the rough. I always think there's opportunity, and it depends. It depends how built out your community is. Some are struggling. Robin mentioned about a community that has very limited amount of greenfield space left for industrial development. It also depends on the economic developer and how long they've been there, what opportunity they've had to really familiarize themselves with their inventory. But I would say this, until you've done an exhaustive search, the answer is always going to be assume that there is still some diamonds in the rough out there. The other component of that, again, is really there's so many hats that an economic developer has to wear, not the least of which, again, is in business retention and recruiting. And I just feel like a lot of time is spent on product development when you can find help to do that, to make sure that your community has been exhaustively explored.
I definitely can add to that. So let me say that I agree with everything that Victor just said on that subject. A lot of it depends on how long the developer's been there. But I do want to put a plug in. There are 88 counties in this state that have rail. And there's already been a study of every potential rail site in every county across. And so if those of you who do have rail, if you will go back to that information that the North Carolina Railroad sent you a few years ago, you'll already have your site identification done. So take a look at those. And by the way, based on what Garrett said too, about looking for mega sites, there were 190 of those parcels or potential sites that were over 1,000 acres. So if you think you don't have a mega site opportunity, then go back to that study, take a look at those maps that were sent to you, and you will find that most of those 88 counties for sure do have some opportunity.
Right, good comments there. Robin, I go a little off script, but it reminds me a bit of, so we have all these things to filter down to sites, but do y'all think that maybe some localities might over filter, and so even in the situation where you may be missing a key piece of infrastructure, at least relative to the mega site initiative. And Garrett may chime in a little bit later, but just, maybe looking past one kind of key point, but not just eliminating that site yourself and getting something in contention. Did y'all have any thoughts on that?
Oh, I've got a good example.
Okay.
So in New Hanover County, as many of you know, offshore wind is a big deal in North Carolina these days, and there are 2 lease areas off of Wilmington and Brunswick County, and there's a lot of old working waterfront in this area because it's been a port city for hundreds of years, and there's a whole lot of growth in this area, and the competition for that waterfront property to turn into what looks like the West Bank what looks like New Jersey shore if you're over on Manhattan, it is real. And so the fact that all of a sudden the offshore wind uses and the need for that working waterfront has come back, New Hanover County has stepped back with their planners to take a serious look at several of the proposed projects that were going to take over that working waterfront. So you have to understand the target industry. You have to have buy-in from the planners and the county commissioners that they know this is needed, and they know that the long-term jobs, not only the investment, but the jobs are important. Those are things that you have to do. So just because you think that you think that it needs a piece of property may not be available and may not be able to be used for something, doesn't mean that the answer is it can't. That you need, if it is best for your need, then you need to make sure that all of the parties understand that and know why, particularly know why, and jump on board with that future.
Yeah, and I would add that when you look at the competition, the fact that the scarcity of resources in real estate assets, it's really about the preponderance of all the evidence about how competitive a site is. And if it's missing one piece of infrastructure, Ryan, to your point, we don't discount those sites necessarily based on what the intensity of use would be and what type of CapEx that would attract. But at the same time, there's a lot of dollars out there to do make site improvements. And when you've got a piece of property that you've done some preliminary due diligence, some preliminary engineering, some planning, that demonstrates that as in a competitive grant environment, at least, that you've got a piece of property that would benefit, you would see an ROI if, say, federal or state dollars were used to make those improvements. So I think there's a lot to be said for continuing to study those properties for that purpose, but also do your level best to capture as much information about these properties and understanding how to filter them when you look at an RFI process, so that you can pull out sites where perhaps one piece that may be missing is not as critical for a particular project.
Now, along those same lines, I think it's important to know what the cost of infrastructure is. So rail and electric transmission line infrastructure are about the same price, and it's 4 times more than it costs to build a water or sewer line. So if you look at the relative cost of infrastructure, that should give you some idea of the relative distance you can be from that infrastructure to know which one's the most important for certain types of projects.
Really good points there, y'all.
Hey, Ryan, could I jump in real quick with—
Go ahead, Garrett.
Piggybacking off of both Robin and Victor on that, is especially, in regards to the mega site program, I think, when we had the webinar last week, I got the feeling that folks, local communities that were going to wanted to participate or were thinking about participating were under the impression that, you had to have something pretty ready to go, so along the question you had, I think that's the purpose of what we're trying to do here, is that, we understand that there is not a perfect site out there, and that, even the ones we are marketing now have, very high cost in infrastructure improvement needs. So if you don't have everything, that's fine. We just would like to know about it. So when we go to and have what those costs are associated with it. So when we go to the General Assembly for this ask, that's what we're going to be putting these dollars into, to help with, getting, improved water, sewer, rail, whatever it is, to these sites. So I think it may have been a little bit overwhelming last week, but the reason why we were asking for so much up front, it didn't mean you had to have all of that now. But what you don't have, then that's a plan to move forward with what we can do to get your site or these sites a little bit, or more, I shouldn't even say a little, more ready. So if you have something, we're encouraging everybody to kind of put their hat in the ring.
I also just want to make a point about control of property.
Yeah.
So, it's sometimes people think, well, if the public entity doesn't own the property so that we can give it away, then, that's more important than not owning it. And certainly in terms of priority, it's best to own it. But given the same amount, given a certain amount of money, I would rather have 10 sites under control than one site that I owned, just for the diversity. Now, some people might disagree with that, but unless that site could be everything to everybody, which most can't, then, and if it's big enough, that's one thing, to be able to be all things to all people. But I like the idea of trying to get things under control. And there are a lot of ways to do that with either first right of refusal or letters of intent and various other legal ways to get control. And it doesn't, one of the things that we know that I've heard from communities and people is that, oh, the landowner doesn't want anybody to know it's for sale, or they don't want to put it out there on the MLS. Well, you don't have to do that either necessarily. If you have conversations with the landowners, then you know whether or not you can go to them when you hear about something that's getting ready to happen. And another one of those situations is existing industry. There are a lot of existing industries that have excess land, and they don't want to put it on the market because it makes a big difference to them who's going to sit down right next to them. But if you know that their extra 100 acres could be available for a certain thing, then that's an easy one to try to keep in the back of, keep in your back pocket. So there are a lot of ways to work with landowners that, that are not as obvious as, oh, the county owns this wonderful piece of property.
Yeah, these are great points, guys. I'm going to jump, related to that, Robin, one thing we definitely wanted to jump into is, site control and acquisition often being one of the most difficult aspects of product development. The overall job of an economic developer, it's got to be one of the biggest pinch points. Let's jump in, and we had a little lightning round, but let's jump to the end of it. Where have you seen things go wrong, and maybe some bad cases that at least we could avoid?
Yeah, I would tell you that on the landowner engagement side, site control at the end of the day is everything. And Robin's alluded to that. We've seen projects lost at the nth hour because ultimately a landowner's decided that their property is 10 times fair market value because there's a project breathing down their neck, and ultimately the deal falls apart. I don't care if it's a $1 billion project. Companies are still going to be sensitive to every dollar that gets spent, and paying exorbitant prices for land outside of fair market value can kill a deal very quickly. And so I think that it's extremely important to work to make sure that your inventory is priced competitively. That's at least one major fail point that I see.
Good stuff, Victor. I'm looking at our time right here. We're at 1:55, and we do have some questions coming through the chat, some of which I can already tell are going to be pretty complex topics. I'll just pop a couple of these. So one individual says the rural center has available land for megasite, or rural North Carolina has available land for megasite development. However, workforce, infrastructure, housing, school systems, et cetera, will be crippled with total job creation associated with a megasite. How are we preparing to respond to these hurdles? That's a big question right there. Let me go ahead and just say what we've done in some of these other webinars when we run out of time. Our panelists can handle these offline, and we'll do a follow-up, and it'll be attached to that blast that has the recording for everybody that registered for the webinar. So we will definitely get to some of those. Mary Lily, I see you chiming in right here. We'll get to those, but let me pop to this last one right here. With promising new sites identified, what advice would you give to local developers in managing expectations of their leadership and helping ensure consistent support even as markets change, which they always are? And that any of you guys can jump in on that.
Well, I mean, again, it's about forming partnerships. I've said a lot of times that planning and zoning, and it's not that planning and zoning and economic developers don't play well in the sandbox together, just a lot of times they're not in the sandbox together. And I think that local elected officials and again, this is county by county. In certain counties, you've got a great partnership. There's a lot of education that's taking place and a bona fide understanding of really the importance of economic development and how challenging it is to bring new jobs into a community. And you've got everybody pulling in on the same end of the rope. But where you don't necessarily have a working relationship on a regular basis, to include the officials from planning and zoning, engineering, drainage, county administration, and your elected officials, to make sure that there's buy-in and agreement that your strategic inventory development process is likely to trigger a need to do a comp plan amendment. And also where you look to provide justification for zoning variances or changes to future land use. All that takes a lot of internal discussion and agreement before you ever get to the first public meeting. And so I think it's critically important to build that coalition internally around the economic development and around the idea of building a real estate asset inventory to allow you to be competitive. And to the other point, Robin had this, I think, or the idea is that when you have very few sites left and you're going to put a governmental office or even a residential development that could go in a multitude of places, and you decide to put it on one of your last remnants of industrial property, and you've lost that opportunity to create good wage paying jobs, sustainable tax revenues, et cetera. It really is, frankly, a lack of cooperation on planning and zoning economic development. So it's really, really important to forge those relationships.
No,
another example is if there's an incompatible use that has shown up at a zoning meeting, you know, where they're considering a rezoning to something that you don't like, show up and be opposed to it. And, you know, don't worry if it's your favorite developer who's also helping to fund the chamber or fund, you know, this, that, or the other. You should have already known that they were working on it and behind the scenes been able to do it. But if they've decided they're going to go forward with it anyway, then you need to show up so that the public understands why it doesn't need to happen. Educating the local planners on the preservation of rail especially. I know I showed up at a public hearing where they were going to put a student apartment complex on a railroad track, and I'm thinking, oh, that's great. Not only is it taking up one of the few industrial sites we got in this town, but we got a bunch of weekend, let's just call them weekend college kids who might want to play on the railroad track on Saturday.
That's great, Robin. That is. I like it. You can kind of bring us out with a bit of gravitas right there, and really just leaning into those critical situations right there. I wish so we just hit 2 o'clock. I'll probably need to close this out. I promise everybody that submitted questions, we'll handle those offline, get you a good thorough response. So let me jump into this right here. Certainly thank Garrett, Robin, Victor, for your time and thoughtful contributions to this discussion. Hopefully our webinar participants, you guys found this conversation helpful. Identifying new sites requires a lot of effort and layers of important considerations for economic development organizations. I know it's helpful to hear all these things. Again, we're grateful for the insights today. I'd like to mention, as chair of professional development, that we're continuing to develop new tools. So like the resource matrix, as well as the directory, we'll be integrating these into the website soon. So you guys will have easy access to this just in the next months ahead. We'll have those rolled out. In the meantime, we'll continue our in-depth review of this theme through upcoming webinars focusing on technical issues, due diligence, legal structure, partnership models and available resources carry us into next year's annual meeting. So thanks again to all our annual sponsors, and our thanks to each of you for joining us today. Watch your email for upcoming in-person and virtual professional development events, including our upcoming luncheon in Raleigh, December 1st. So please also save the date for the spring conference in Pinehurst, March 7th through 8th. And with that said, really hope everybody has a great day, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.